Hi all, my name is Annie Fox and I am the Provincial Assistant for Social Ministry Organizing for Jesuits West, which means I support schools, parishes, and universities that are part of the Jesuit Catholic tradition to do community organizing and advocacy work, both here in Washington State and all across the West Coast. And today I'm going to be talking to you a little about how you can use writing, letters, and social media to effectively advocate to your legislators for change in your community. So give me a second while I get my slides up here. So when we talk about reaching out to our legislators, I think we want to keep in mind what actually impacts how our legislators decide to vote on an issue. And I think most legislators, it can be said, think about three major things when they decide how to vote on an issue. The first is, how many of my constituents care about this issue? How many people are talking about it? And what do they think? But the second thing that I don't think we always think about is they ask themselves, how deeply do my constituents care about it? Okay, everybody thinks this is a good thing, but is this something that they care enough about that they would actually change their vote, who they would vote for and elect based on this decision? Is this something that it's worth my taking a political risk on? Is it something I really have to take seriously? And the third is, are there any other people who are highly influential in my district who care strongly about this issue? Are there people who write op-eds, people who give sermons, people who fundraise, where I need to worry about what they're going to think about this issue? So that means when we're trying to influence a legislator and how they vote on something, we want to convince them, A, that a lot of people care about it, B, that people care deeply about it, that it actually would impact how they vote, or C, that people who are highly influential and are going to impact a lot of other voters care about this issue. So that influences how we think about contacting a legislator. And I think especially influences when how we think about contacting a legislator, depending on how many people we have around our table that we can mobilize into action. So I like to think about this as the question of breadth and depth. How do we show our legislators that a lot of people care about this, but also how do we show them that they care about it deeply, so much so that it would actually influence who they decide to elect in the future? So when we think about how we get our legislators' attention through writing, when we only have a small group of people, that means that we really have to rely on showing the depth of commitment and also showing that highly influential people care about this issue. So how do we do that? Well, one of the easiest ways to do that is to place an op-ed, to actually be the people who are helping to shape public opinion. And while it's really hard to get an op-ed on the New York Times or on the Washington Post, it's actually not that hard to be able to place an op-ed in your local city paper or town paper. And our legislators really care about those papers because those are the things that people in their district read. So that's always a really good go-to. And if you can get a highly influential person to place that op-ed, maybe the principal of a school or your pastor, all the better. Maybe you can get a couple of influential people to sign it. Another way to do this would be to see if you can find a highly influential person to write to your legislator. When we have a medium amount of people, I think of this as maybe more than 20 people that we think we can get to engage a legislator or take action on our issue. We might ask people to tweet at a legislator. Tweets are really interesting because they're very easy to do, but because they're done in public, kind of similar to an op-ed, legislators tend to pay a lot of attention to them, especially if we specifically say at the legislator when we send out those tweets. Again, we might consider sending in some kind of letter to our legislator and asking some highly influential people in our network to do this. In faith-based organizing, we do this often with a clergy sign-on letter. Maybe we could find 5 to 10 clergy, especially if they represent multiple communities, multiple faith traditions even, but even within the Catholic Church, if we can find priests from different neighborhoods, maybe priests who represent a diversity of different constituents to write to our elected officials, that can be really influential. And again, it doesn't have to be priests. It can also be highly influential people in your community. Maybe you have parishioners who are also teachers or head of a local charity or have other influence in the community. Maybe they're the head of the Knights of Columbus. Finding those people who you think will help get your legislators' attention and know that this is being taken seriously by community leaders. And then also, I want to just advocate for making phone calls. It's not part of this written work, but especially to somebody who is a state assembly member or a senator, even if you can just get 20 phone calls into that elected official's office in a day, that's likely to get their attention. It doesn't work when you're contacting people in Washington, D.C. Those people get hundreds of phone calls a day, and 20 phone calls probably wouldn't make much of a dent. But if you're contacting a state legislator, something like 10 to 20 phone calls really can have some influence because phone calls show a depth of commitment to an issue. So when we have a lot of people that we can mobilize, but we know that they don't have a lot of time, there's a lot more freedom of what we can do. First of all, we can use form letters where we pre-write a letter and just ask people to sign on to this. And the Washington State Catholic Conference has their own action alert system that you can utilize. When you get an action alert from them, you can send that out to other people and ask them to take action. You can put a link to these kinds of action alerts in your weekly bulletin at the parish. Or put it in a link chat, especially now that we're online, put it in a link at the end of your Zoom mass or in whatever way you want, put it out in prayer groups. Those little things really help show the breadth of how many people care about an issue like this. Although on the flip side, sign-on letters tend to not show a lot of depth because it's such an easy task to do and legislators know that. But another option is to do one big electronic letter where we're asking people to add their signature. Now, these two things may sound a little similar, so I just want to be really clear. In the first one, we're creating a form letter through something like Action Alert that actually creates an individually generated letter to someone's specific elected official. So you can use web technology to say, this letter will go to your elected officials in your district, and you can edit that letter however much you want. The second option, option B, is one big letter that's more like a petition where every single elected official is going to see the same letter and just see hundreds or hopefully sometimes thousands of signatures added to that letter. I think option A tends to be a little more helpful, but it can be a little more complicated in terms of technology. So both are really helpful. And frankly, option B is nice because it means that everybody else sees how many people signed on to it. And it can be really powerful to see all those signatures in one place. So then we want to think about what goes into the letter. How do we create letters that are actually impactful? And I want to say, I think this applies even to something like tweets, because you can do a powerful tweet really quickly. So first, we want to say in the letter, who do we represent? Especially if we just have a small group writing. If we have a group of 5 pastors who are signing on to a letter, we as those 5 pastors want to say, we are only 5 people, but we, in each of us, represent 1,000 people in our parishes, and we represent X, Y, and Z neighborhoods, and we represent families and adults, and we have many teachers in our schools. We want to really convey to our elected officials who are the people we're speaking for to help give them a sense of who we think cares about this issue. The second is obviously to state what is the issue we care about. And I want to make sure to mention, how do we want them to vote on this issue? Because sometimes we will call and say, I really care about restorative justice, or I really care about immigration, or I really care about preventing abortion. But when it comes to a piece of legislation, we don't tell them how we actually want them to vote on that piece of legislation. And sometimes these letters, when elected officials are going through many of them, if we're not really specific about the piece of legislation and how we want them to vote, it's not always clear what they're supposed to do with it. And then 3, we take some time to talk about, why is this important to us? okay, we want you to vote this way, but why? Why does that reflect our faith values? And that helps demonstrate some of that depth, that this isn't just something we heard about one day and we thought was a good idea. This is something we truly care about, and we help give them some of that sense of social analysis of why these issues are important. So I want to take a minute just to look at a couple of what I think of are some really strong letters and kind of show how that shows up in this. So this is a letter from Justice for Immigrants, and this is something that they did as a sign-on letter, where they asked lots and lots of people to sign on to a letter. And you'll see they say, as the American people remain resolute in COVID-19, they talked about why this issue is important to them. But then they also talked about who they represent and tried to connect this issue to a letter that came out from the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. And that helps give some credibility, saying that we care about this as individual people signing on, but we're also standing with the leaders of the Catholic Church across the country. And then finally, they got really specific in their asks. Down here, they get to the actual meat of the issue and what they want the legislators to do and make sure gets included in the legislation. So this is what we would call kind of a petition. I'm sorry, this isn't a petition. This is a form letter where you can see an individual letter is going to go out to each elected official, and people just edit that information where they can create different details. And again, this is something that you can do with the local Catholic conference here using the action alert system. The other kind of letter that I just want to take a minute to look at is another letter that came out from the Catholic Conference of Bishops, where they were speaking as bishops on behalf of the parishioners and other people they serve in the Catholic Church. So you can see again here, they started by talking again about who they are and what they represent. We write on behalf of the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops Committee on Migration, and then also listed other groups that are working with them, Catholic Relief Services, and then started to talk about the specific legislation around TPS, and of course then spent many paragraphs talking about why that is important to them, both in terms of what's at stake with human beings, and then also how that fits into their Catholic values. So these are some really strong examples of letters, both in terms of the form letters that come from individuals and what it means to do a big sign-on letter that has fewer people as the actual authors of it, but is still really powerful in communicating who it represents. And that's some things to think about in how you contact your legislative officials through writing.